Hi, in this video, we're going to walk through the solution for Preppin Data Challenge 2022, Week 16 in Alteryx. My name is Kelly Gilbert. I'm Alteryx Advanced Certified, and I do these challenges every week in both Alteryx and Python. I'll leave a link to my GitHub repo in the description below. So Preppin Data is a weekly data preparation challenge, and it's really intended for practicing Tableau prep. But if you're like me and you don't use Tableau prep in your day-to-day work, these challenges are a really great practice to use with whatever data preparation tool you want to learn. So before we dig in, I'll say that my solution here is going to be a little bit more complex than necessary to solve this particular simple data set that we're given. When I approach these challenges, I really try to think about how I would solve this if I were given this particular problem at work. So I try to think about how to make my solution dynamic enough to handle changes that might come across in the data or make it easy to maintain in the future. So let's start off by looking at the challenge description. So this week, the scenario we have is the Preppin Data team are going out to dinner, and the restaurant system gives them some options for different courses. So let's go ahead and look at this order data. The input data this week is an Excel file with two sheets. So the first sheet is orders, and you can see we have two columns for each person. So Carl has a column with all of the dish options that he was given, and then check marks to show which ones he chose. Same thing for Tom, same thing for Jenny, and same thing for Jonathan. And in between, we have these blank columns that are just kind of spacers. And so intermixed in with the dish names are these course headers. So we have a header here that says starters, and then here's the list of all the options for starters. And you can see that Carl has chosen the prawn cocktail for his starter. And then you have a section header for mains, and then all of the main dishes, and then a section header for dessert and all of those choices. So the second input that we're given is a recipe ID and a dish. So the recipe ID is a number, and then the dish is just the name of the dish. So basically, we need to prepare a final list that just has the selections that people have made, and then the number of the dish. So maybe to the kitchen, that prawn cocktail is, they just know that is number 18. So we need to give them data that has that classified as recipe 18. We also need the guest name to be in rows and not in columns like it is now. And we also need those course headers pulled out. So this is what we're aiming to get. So we'll go over to Alteryx and get started. So I'm going to start out by inputting the data. So we'll go ahead and drag on an input data tool. And we'll navigate to the menu input file. And we'll pick up that orders tab first. So since this is an Excel file with two tabs, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this input tool and paste the copy down, and then I'll just change the tab name. So we'll just go ahead and go to the configuration name and change the tab name. So I'm going to go over here to the row that says table or query, and I'm going to click the ellipsis and then select the lookup table sheet and then hit OK. All right, so now I have my two inputs in the workflow. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of those blank spacer columns. So we'll go ahead into the preparation tab and drag on a data cleansing tool. And all we're going to do is remove the null columns. So this is a fairly new addition to the data cleansing tool, and this will just get rid of any columns that are totally null. I'm also going to select none here under the fields to cleanse and deselect all of those fields because I don't want to perform any other data cleansing to the fields. I just want to remove the totally blank columns. All right, now that we've got rid of those, we're going to transpose the data so that what used to be in columns are in rows. Before I do that, I'm going to go add a record ID to my data. So record ID is just going to add a sequential number that's going to number the rows. So I'm going to call that row number. And now I'll go over to transform and get my transpose tool. So I'm going to choose that row number that I just added as my key column because I want to keep that as is, but I want to take all of the other columns and rotate them so they're no longer in columns, but they're in rows. So let's add a meaningful annotation to that. A recent, I guess it's not that recent, but maybe 2020 add is the shortcut key of F2. So if you click on a tool and hit F2, it will take you straight to the annotation window, and it'll even put your cursor in there so you can just start typing right away. So I'm going to give this a meaningful annotation. All right, so let's run this workflow and see what the results are. So we can see we're getting some warnings down here, and that's okay. It's just telling us that some of the fields are missing, and those are the fields that the data cleansing tool removed. So it's just the metadata that's flowing into the transpose tool doesn't have the effects of the cleanse tool known at the time. So we can go ahead and click on the transpose tool and go over to the configuration and change this missing columns behavior to ignore to get rid of those warnings. All right, so looking at the output of the transpose tool, we can see now that we have 8 rows for each original row. So it's taken the 8 columns, we had 2 columns per person, and it's just rotated those. So now they're in the rows instead of in the columns. So if we look at this row number 2 in particular, if we go to the original input, the second row here, the first column is prawn cocktail, and then the second column is checkmark. And then this third column we got rid of. So we should have prawn cocktail, checkmark, prawn cocktail, null, reading down our rows. So let's go back to Alteryx, and we can see prawn cocktail, checkmark, prawn cocktail, null. So it's just basically taken that row and rotated it so it's vertical. And it's done that, of course, with all the rows. So the next thing I'm going to need to do is I need to identify that these 2 rows are both Carl. So this is the row, or this is the former column that had the dish name in it, and this is the former column that had Carl's checkmark in it. So I need to verify, or I need to recognize that, hey, these are both Carl's, these are both Tom, these are both Jerry or Jenny. So we will go ahead and use a multi-row formula tool. So whenever I hear copy down or fill down, that's always a signal that I need to use multi-row formula. So I'm going to create a new field, and I'm going to call it guest. And I'm going to change the type to a variable width string, and we'll just make it bigger. Who knows, maybe someday we'll want to put full names in here instead of first names. So then I'm going to put in an expression to apply. So the difference between multi-row formula and a regular formula is that a regular formula can only access the columns for a specific row. But multi-row formula can access values that are on a different row, which is what we need here, because we need to essentially copy down. So when we look at our output from transpose, you can see I've got the name of the columns, what used to be the columns, right? I've got Carl, and then the second column is just named F2. So when Alteryx brings in columns that don't have a header in them, it's just going to sequentially number them. I assume F stands for field. So it's just going to sequentially number them F2, F3, F4, F5, that sort of thing. So we need to associate this column F2 with Carl. So in my multi-row formula tool, what I'm doing is I am using a regular expression match. And you can certainly do this with regular string functions if you want to. Regex match is going to probably catch things a little bit better, but you can certainly do it with string functions if you wanted to. So if you're not familiar with regular expressions, they're just special syntax that allow you to find patterns in strings, or match patterns in strings in this case. So this is a regex pattern. And so it is looking for a literal capital F. And then /D is kind of like shorthand in regex for a digit or a number 0 through 9. And then the plus sign tells us how many. So plus sign means 1 or more. So what I'm saying is match the pattern capital F, then 1 or more digits. So I'm going to check the name column and see if that matches F and then a number. So this will match, since it's one or more, it would match F5, it would match F500, it would match F999. So this will be flexible, even if we have more columns in the future, if we add people to the right. All right, so what it's going to say is if you find a match, if it matches F number, then use the name from the previous row, otherwise use the name from the current row. So let's go ahead and run that and see how it works. All right, so looking at the output, we can see this first row, we're going to check the name column, which is the old column names. We're going to check that and see if it matches the F number pattern. So Carl does not match that pattern, so we're going to be down here in the else. So since it does not match the pattern, we're just going to take the name as is and return Carl, which it did. When we go to the second row, we're going to see if it matches our pattern. And this time it does. F2 matches that F number pattern. So we're going to be up here and we're going to use the row -1 name, which means the name from the previous row. So I'm going to go up one row and use the name, which is Carl. And you can see we've got Carl there. So I'm going to do the same thing for all the rows. So now I've identified that these 2 rows go to Carl and these are Tom's and these are Jenny's. And while I'm at it, I'll give this a meaningful annotation. Okay, so now I've got 2 columns for Carl, but I need to specify what they are. So I know this row, the first row is the names of the dishes, and the second row is the check mark, whether or not he selected those. So I'm going to use a regular formula in this case. And I'm going to call this new column name. All right, and then we're going to use another if statement. So we're going to say if name equals guest, then dish, otherwise selection. And eventually these are going to be our column names. So if you remember, the name was the original column name and the guest is what we just created with our multi-row formula. So what we're saying is if the name is equal to guest, then that means it's the first column with the dish in it. If the name is not the same as the guest, then that means it's the second column with the check mark in it. So we're saying if it's the same, then return dish, otherwise return selection. So let's go ahead and run it and see how that works. So now you can see it's correctly labeling the first column for each person as the dish column and the second column, or the dish row, and the second as the selection row. All right, so now we've identified our new columns. Now we just need to shift those up into columns. So we're going to use let me annotate this first. All right, so now we need to shift dish and selection into columns. So we're going to go over to our transform tab, and we're going to basically do the opposite of transpose. So with transpose, we took our columns and made them into rows. And now with crosstab, we're going to take our rows and make them into columns. So we'll put our crosstab tool up there. And then I'm going to group by row number and guest. And then I'm going to use the new column name that I just created as the column headers. So I want my new column headers to be either dish or selection. And then I'm going to put the value in the intersection. And so for aggregation, it doesn't matter which one you pick, because in this particular example, we only have one possible value for each combination. So it doesn't matter what you pick, I'm just going to pick first. All right, and then we'll annotate that. All right, so let's run it and we'll see how we're doing. Okay, so now you can see feeding. So I'm going to click the input anchor to the crosstab tool. So going into the crosstab, we've got 104 records and we've got dish and selection on different rows. The output of crosstab, now we have half as many records, right? So we only have 52 records because now dish and selection are in their own columns. So while I'm here, I'm just going to organize my workflow a little bit and add these to their own container. And because all we're doing here is reshaping the data. All right. So we're getting pretty close to the end format, but we need to deal with those course names. So if we go back to the original data, remember we've got the names of the courses kind of mixed in with the dish names. So we have to get those out into their own column somehow. So we have to figure out, we have to have a way to flag which rows are course names. And then the other thing we have to deal with is spelling. So you can see that the spelling is not the same across people. Sometimes it's plural and sometimes it's singular. Same thing with dessert. So we have dessert, 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 desserts, plural. So we need to kind of standardize those. So let's go over and look at the output and see what they have in the output. So in the output, it looks like mains and starters are plural, but dessert is singular. So that's how they want it in the output. So we'll need to kind of fix all that. So we have a couple things going on here. We first have to extract the headers. We have to identify which rows have the headers in them, and then we have to copy them down for all of the dishes and also fix the spelling. All right, so back to Alteryx. So I'll show you the way that I did this. Now, this is another one of those things that I did that are probably overkill, but I tried to think about how I would handle this as a real work problem. So what I did was I used a text input tool and I created my own custom course mapping. So the text input tool is over here on the in and out tab. And it just allows you to basically manually key in your own tabular data as an input to the workflow. So I created a table that has two columns, the original course name that's in the raw data, and then the course name that I would like it to be. So this does two things. This tells me, first of all, these are the legitimate course name headers. When you see these things, you know that it's a header course name. And then I am assigning the appropriate spelling. So when you see starter, make it starters. When you see starters, leave it as is. And again, you can certainly do this with text functions. That is a completely legitimate way to do this. I'll explain why I did it this way. So when I'm editing a workflow, I've built a lot of workflows over my lifetime of using Alteryx, and maybe say 6 months down the road, a year down the road, we decide to add a new course. So maybe we're going to add a beverage option. So I'm going to open up this workflow after having not looked at it for 6 months to a year, and I need to try to figure out which formula tool did I hard code those course names into. So the reason I'm doing this way, even though it's a little bit more complicated to build in the first place, is it's going to be a lot easier to maintain and it's going to be a lot more flexible. So if I have to add a beverage category later, it's going to be very easy for me to just add that. And I might maybe add myself a comment or add in the annotation some instructions on, what I need to do, because I won't remember when I have to look at this 6 months down the road. So anyway, that's why I chose to do it that way. Again, it's overly complex for this particular simple data set that we're working with here, but that's what I'm doing. So I need to get those, I need to somehow join that to my data coming out of my crosstab tool. So I'm going to use a find and replace tool. And so I'll join up the output of the crosstab into the find input of the tool, and then I'm going to do my custom mapping and add that to the replace input of the anchor of the tool. So we'll go over to the configuration window and we'll find within field dish, because remember the course names are kind of mixed in with the dish names. So I'm going to look in the dish column and I'm going to try to match the original course name. So whenever I find one of those things that are in original course name in my manual lookup, then I know that I've found a course heading. I'm also going to go over here and change it to entire field instead of part of the field, because I have, particularly I have a course name that is main, M-A-I-N. What if I had a dish that is, say, Maine lobster, like the state, M-A-I-N-E? I would not want to match that, right? Because that is not a course header. So I will only want to match when the entire field is one of those course names. And so what do I want to do when I find a match? I want to append a new field. So I'm going to choose append fields to record and choose course, which is the corrected spelling column. So look in the dish column. When you find a match to original course name, put the correct spelling course in a new column. And let's go ahead and run the workflow so we can see what that did. Okay. So if we increase the size there, we can see that it correctly identified starters and starter as course headers and correctly returned starters, which we want that one to be plural. And then if we go down to dessert, we wanted that to be singular. So it correctly matched dessert and desserts and returned singular dessert. All right, so that's great, but now we need to fill that down, right? We need that to be in the row with all of the dishes. So, oh, I just said fill down. What tool do I need? So let's go over to multi-row formula tool. Whenever I hear fill down or copy down, I know that's the tool that I need. So, so we'll go ahead and annotate our find and replace first. So before we do the find and replace though, this is another overkill thing, but I'm gonna go ahead and sort the data going into it. So as you can imagine, the multi-row formula tool is very sensitive to the ordering of the rows coming into it, right? So it doesn't care anything about, it doesn't know whether the row above it is valid or not. It just says, if you tell me to use the row above, I'm going to use exactly the row above. So let's go ahead and sort first by guest and then by row number. And let's go back to the original input so you can see why this is important. So right now, in this simple input that we're given for this challenge, all of the course headers are on the same row for every person, right? So every person, this first row has the starter course header, and then the mains course header is always on row 5. So we really don't have to worry about the sorting. We could just say, go into our multi-row formula tool and just say, let's look at this output here. And so we could just say, hey, just fill down until you hit something that's not null. And then when you hit mains, then you just use mains until you hit something that's not null. We could do that, but what happens if that wasn't the case, where the headers are all in the same row? Like, what if Carl only had 2 choices for starter and his mains header was in row 3, but everyone else's, or was in his mains header was in row 4, but everyone else's is in row 5? Then you could have some issues where you're copying down the wrong header to the wrong row for each person. Another issue could be, hey, maybe Jenny's starters are in a different order than anybody else's. So maybe her starters are underneath her mains. Then you would have, then you would have problems if you just copied down. So that's why we're sorting. Again, not relevant to this particular simple data set, but I'm just trying to think of what might go wrong in the future and how do I head it off. So, so I'm going to sort first by guest and then by row number within each guest. And that way I know that the previous row is definitely going to be the right header for this person. All right, so in this case, I'm just going to update the existing course field. So we'll go ahead and select course. And then I'm going to use another expression here, another if statement. So I'm going to say if on the current row the course is null, then use the course from the previous row. Otherwise, just keep the course from the current row as is. And I could group by guest, but we do know that the header name has to be the first row for each person. So I'm not going to do that here, but you could, if you really wanted to be careful, you could do that. So let's go ahead and run the workflow and we'll look at what that's doing. So if I look at my input to the multi-row formula, we can see we are correctly identifying the rows that have the starter header in them, but it's null in between, and we need to copy that down. So what we're saying is if course is null, so this first row is not null, so I'm going to be down here in the else, and I'm just going to return the course name as is. But when I go down to the second row, course is null. So I'm going to be up here and I'm going to use the course from row -1. So I'm going to go up here and then I would make that starters. And so now the second row is then going to become starters. When I go down to the third row, again, my course is null. So I'm up here and I'm going to use course from the previous row, which is now row 2. And since we filled that in with starters, it's going to be starters again. So it's just going to do that until it hits something that's not null. And it's going to fill that, it would fill mains in until it hits something that's not null. So if we look at the output from the multi-row formula tool, we can see that's exactly what has happened. All right, so these tools are all kind of relevant. They're all kind of doing the same thing. So let's annotate this. So these are all kind of trying to figure out the course name and fill it down. So we'll put them in a container and say, all of those tools together are identifying the course name. All right. So now we're getting pretty close to the output that we want. The two things we need to do is we need to get rid of all of these rows that were not selected because we just need to output the things, the meals or the dishes that were selected. And then we need to add that recipe ID. So let's throw in a filter tool. And so we'll say where the selection, remember selection is the field with the check mark. So we're going to say where that is not null. We want to keep it. And then we will use a join field, or a join tool, sorry. And we'll hook that up to the true output of our filter. And then we'll bring in the recipe ID lookup from our original input and hook that into our join tool. So if we go over to our recipe ID lookup, we've got only 2 columns in this. It's the recipe ID number and then the dish name. So the only thing we have to join these 2 fields together is the dish name. So we're just going to hope that they are always coming from the same database and they're always spelled the same. It's always a little dicey when you have a kind of long text field like that. It could be punctuated differently in 2 different systems, but we're going to hope they come from the same system and they're always the same. So we're going to go over to our join field and join on dish name. And so while we're over here in our join tool, we can actually kind of clean up our fields and get things ready for output. So this row number field, we don't need that anymore. We can get rid of it. We can deselect it. The selection field, that's the check mark field. We don't need that anymore after the filter, so we can get rid of it. And then the second version of dish, so where that dish is coming from the lookup input, and we don't need that anymore because we've already got the dish from the first input. So we can deselect that. So now we're down to 4 fields, which is what we want. But I think we need to change the order. So let's go over to the expected output. And so the order of the fields should be guest, course, recipe ID, dish. All right, so let's go back to Alteryx. So I'm not in the right order. So course and recipe ID, they need to be between guest and dish. So I'm going to click on course and then control click on recipe IDs to select both fields at once. And then I'm going to right click with my mouse and drag up and then let go when I'm in between guest and dish. And so now I've moved both of those fields at the same time. So now I've got guest, course, recipe ID, dish, which is what I wanted. And so let's output that data. So the challenge wants us to output that to a text file or a CSV file. So we'll go ahead and choose a CSV file. And Alteryx updates the configuration to things that are relevant to a CSV. So we'll change the encoding to UTF-8. And let me annotate my join while I'm here. All right, so that should give us the results that we want. So let's go ahead and run the workflow one final time, and we'll compare our output to the provided output. So normally for the Preppin Data Challenge, they'll provide a file with the output so you can, actually do a comparison. In this case, there were only 12 records, so they just provided a screenshot with the results in it. So we'll look at our results, and they're in lots of different orders. So we'll go ahead and sort by guest name, and then we can just kind of visually inspect. So we can look at Carl's 3 rows and then kind of check to make sure that I've got the right dishes for Carl. And then I can do the same thing for Jenny, Jonathan, and Tom, and just make sure I got the right results, which I did. So we are good to go. And one final thing, of course, doesn't really matter for these challenges, but just thinking about my normal work, I'm just going to clean up my workflow and prettify it a little bit. So I'm going to select all these tools that are all in one row, and I'm going to go Control-Shift-sign to make sure that those are all aligned in the same line. You can also select the tools, then right-click and choose Align Horizontally. And then I'm going to do the same thing with all the inputs. I'm going to select all of those, Control-Shift+ to line those all up vertically. And you can also, again, right-click and choose Align Vertically. We could also, select all of the stuff in this container, and we can say Distribute Horizontally, and that will make even space between all the tools, but we don't need to do all of that for this exercise. But so now we have a really nice looking, well-organized, well-annotated workflow, and we're done. So we've completed week 16. So we're not totally done yet. The last thing we need to do is share our work. So we'll go over back to the Preppin Data blog. And at the bottom of each challenge post, the folks that create the challenge for us, they've got some instructions here of things you can do after you finish. Again, totally optional, but these are great to both provide feedback to the people who create the challenges and also share your work with everyone else in the community. So you can fill in the participation tracker, and it's just a Google form where you enter your name, the week that you completed, and then a rating on how difficult you thought it was. So the ratings are from 1 to 10. 10 is I cried. I don't think any of these have ever made me cry, but there have definitely been some 8 out of 10 difficulties. So you can use that to kind of provide input to the challenge creators on how difficult you thought it was. And then the second thing that you can do after you finish is to share on Twitter. So I guess most of the Tableau Prep community, there is some kind of discussion on the Tableau community boards there. But for those of us who don't use Tableau Prep, I think the main way to communicate is through Twitter. So you can share your solution on Twitter by using the Preppin Data hashtag, no G, Preppin Data. And then make sure to tag the creators. So Carl, Jenny, and Tom, they're the folks that work really hard every week to create these challenges and provide them for us. So make sure to tag them on your solution and thank them for doing this for us. And then if you can, post your solutions on GitHub, or maybe put a screenshot of your solution in your tweet so that we can see how you solved it. I've been using Alteryx a long time, and I still learn new things by looking at everyone else's solution. So especially this one, there are so many ways you can solve it. So I would love to see your solutions if you do this in Alteryx. So please do share your solution with the Preppin Data hashtag, and I would love to see it. So I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you next week.